Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Beetlejuice from 1988. Now, I think most people know Beetlejuice. If they haven't seen it, they know of it. It's one of those culturally mimetic films that at least is visually special enough to be recognizable by most folks, regardless of their direct recognition of it. And I've never seen it. And it's weird that I've never seen it because I've seen a lot of things in and around the same sort of cinematic space, to the point that it's kind of surprising that I have never seen it. It's also a weird one, and one actually that until I was reading up on it after, I assumed was not very successful and was kind of a cult film. Turns out it was pretty commercially successful. Allegedly making, allegedly on a budget of only $15 million, which in '88 is not, pennies, but it's not a ton of money either, and making back $74 million. So that's a surprise for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is just in 1988, who's going to see this? Who's going to be enticed by it and want to see it? Because it's a weird film, and it's directed by Tim Burton, who nowadays we have a lot of associations with, positive or negative or just general. But Tim Burton was not really a name in 1988. He had only made I think one other film that had been successful, but not enough to make Tim Burton a name yet. It does have a pretty star-studded cast, although a lot of the people in the movie are a lot of the stars are, while notable actors, perhaps not big names at the time. I didn't check on everyone. Alec Baldwin, Gina Davis, Jeffrey Jones, Catherine O'Hara, Winona Ryder, Michael Keaton. That's the main cast. And they're all very substantial actors in their own right. But it was 1988. I had to do some checking. I was looking at Winona Ryder going, she looks crazy young. And Winona Ryder has always looked very young. She looks young now. But I was like, but Winona Ryder's in her 50s. And I'm like, so I checked her age. She was 17 when this was made. Which that math doesn't seem right until you actually do the math, and it's slightly upsetting how long it's been since 1988. Anyway, yeah. I don't think this was her first role, but she does great in it. Actually, wasn't she in something else we watched? I think she was in the Dracula movie. Hold on a second. Now I'm going to be confused for a moment. Yeah, she was in Bram Stoker's Dracula. But that was in '92. That was 4 years later. So she didn't even have that under her belt, and she was obviously still very young at that point. This is a weird film filled with a lot of weird stuff, and it confuses me why it was commercially successful. It does not have a very strong plot. It does not have a very complicated plot. It is not particularly accessible as a piece of art either. It's got a lot of sort of dry, dark humor, an aesthetic style that doesn't really align with much of anything. I'll come back to that in a minute. And like this was not a time or place when the world was primed for like the Tim Burton aesthetic. In a way, this to me feels like peak Tim Burton in terms of having not yet been locked into a singular style, but being very adventurous in terms of visual exploration and exploration of various media. I think that Tim Burton is unfairly maligned sometimes, fairly sometimes, and unfairly other times, for having like a very visually distinctive style and a lot of like aesthetic choices that are very common, have a lot of commonalities between his different films. This one's a bit of an outlier, but definitely shows some of the precursors to what would become his style. There's a bunch of different films I was thinking about while I was watching this. One of them was, well, okay. One of them was, or two of them. Let me back up. Two of them are very old. One was Nosferatu, and one was Metropolis. And both of those are essentially German expressionism at their not necessarily their height, but they are German expressionist in their stylings, and a lot of that aesthetic is sort of hard to find after the like early part of the 20th century. There are people who have picked up elements of German expressionism and used it in their aesthetics, but it's fascinating to see it here because it made me reflect on other Tim Burton written and directed things. He didn't write this one, but he did direct it, that have elements of that German expressionist, like slightly absurdist visual style that are present in his other films, but not nearly as apparent. They are much more muted or integrated into other more modern stylings. This film also shows a lot of other things that would come later in his career in terms of use of mixed media and practical effects and cartoonish, absurd visual choices. How much of that was actually his deliberate choice and how much was a limitation of his budget, I am kind of curious about. This film has very limited, it actually may have no digital effects. They might be in film, possibly, I don't actually know. But the effects are pretty few that aren't very apparently practical. There's a lot of use of masks and like some animatronics. There's claymation. There are a bunch of different camera tricks that are all really interesting and lead into things he would work on later, whether that's Batman Returns or James and the Giant Peach or Nine even, which he has various roles, sometimes producer, sometimes director, sometimes writer, sometimes some combination. But a lot of the seeds for a lot of those other things seem to be planted here. And whether they came organically or whether they were a planned thing is something we'll probably never know, but like is kind of interesting to reflect on, knowing what the next, 30 plus years, I was about to say 20, of his career and several of the other people in this movie's careers would look like. Similarly, I want to point out the music in particular. This is scored by Danny Elfman, who was not an unknown name at the time, but Danny Elfman, well, I'm not particularly fond of Danny Elfman as a composer generally. He has his place, but he's been dramatically overused, and a lot of his music, especially in the last actually 20 years since 2000, has become very samey. A lot of the same instrumentation, very similar leitmotifs, very similar tones, very generic sounding. And I don't entirely blame that on him. In fact, I've seen an interview with him in conversation with some other composers where they bemoan the state of composing, where they say either I was brought in to compose something that sounds like somebody else's work because that's just what they wanted and they wouldn't take anything else, or they just asked me to redo this other score that I did but slightly different so it was legally distinct, and it made me very unhappy. So I don't totally blame him. However, it's fascinating to see him here because he's a little bit more experimental, but it still sounds very much like a Danny Elfman score. There's some similar instrumentation, some similar choices of tempo and dynamics that are very reminiscent of a lot of his other work, but are distinctive enough. And weirdly, there's some music in here that I didn't know was from this film, but I've heard in other things, reused in other things, either licensed or unlicensed. That part is a question. But his talents are definitely on display here, and I think the soundtrack works really very well. Overall, the visuals and the audio come together really wonderfully. There are some elements of it that are not as polished as they could be, whether that is whether that is because of inexperience or budgetary constraints or time constraints or shooting constraints. It's hard to ever know, but none of it is glaring enough to cause any substantial problems. Like I said, I think the casting is excellent. Everybody plays their roles excellently. Catherine O'Hara has been a little bit typecast over the years into this very sort of taskmaster, kind of unpleasant, motherly slash domineering figure, but she does it excellently. Jeffrey Jones being sort of a little bit like Jeffrey Jones basically plays Jeffrey Jones, and he does it great. Winona Ryder is great as just this sort of moody teen who's not miserable to listen to. She's not goth. She's not emo. She's not edgy. This is pre that era. But she's like, she seems very genuine. Her feelings are not they didn't come from somewhere else. She didn't learn it from somebody. She generally is miserable and expresses herself in these very authentic feeling ways, while also not being a character that grates on you. I love her performance. It's really very excellent and charming. This whole movie is incredibly charming. Michael Keaton as Beetlejuice, we're going to come back to him, but is fantastic. Like, he's chewing on the scenery every time he's on screen. He's an actor's actor. He's got a long history of ups and downs in terms of the actual quality of the movies he's been in, probably more bad than good. But I really like Michael Keaton. I think he's a fascinating actor, and his range of talent is really quite good, and he's a little underrated, actually. Alec Baldwin and Geena Davis, while not putting on performances that are like substantially different from other things I've seen them in, this is very young Alec Baldwin and young Geena Davis, and they are nothing is wrong with their performances. They put on a very good show. I would actually say their performances are excellent. It's only in context of other things that they would do later that it shows some of the sort of same, like the similarities, the sameness of some of their performances. But as this couple who are very loving, like it's a weirdly authentic feeling and cute couple that does not feel contrived or overblown, or they're not trying to be cute together. They have genuinely very good chemistry on screen together. And I think they work really well. There are a bunch of minor characters as well who I think are all really good. The let's call her the caseworker for not spoiler reasons, is a ton of fun. There are some other standouts as well. They're all really well cast. And they're all, they've clearly gotten some good direction in terms of their performances. They're also dressed and made up excellently. The costumes are always on point, whether it's the more absurd or the more realistic. They always fit the scene that they're in. The makeup is excellent, both in terms of just very practical, like humans wearing makeup, and the more horrific makeup that then sort of leans into practical effects, models, masks, rubber things. There's a little bit of it that looks a little cheesy, but I think it's supposed to, or it's just like, we're going full absurd on this. And so you're just like, that's just chunks of foam. And you're like, yeah, but that feels right for some reason. And so I'm really very happy with a lot of the production values sort of all over this thing. Where it starts to be a problem is that I ended this film not really knowing what I watched. And I entered the film not knowing what I was about to get into. And frankly, neither of those things have really changed. I don't really know what the film is about. And I don't really know what it was supposed to be about. My only real knowledge of this film is through, a couple of, memes and things, image macros, and then like just a general fandom. I didn't know the plot. I didn't know the context. And so it's weird to see the plot unfold the way it is, to the point that I think there are two potentially really interesting films in here that don't really belong together. One is very minor spoilers, I think, from here on out. You're not really watching the movie for the plot anyway. And this is all given up in the first few minutes anyway. The one plot is this couple who dies, and their house is taken over, and they want the people who have taken over their house out of it because they're ghosts, they're haunting it. And how a haunting works, and all of the comedy that can come with this idea of a bureaucracy of ghosts, and what are the practicalities of trying to be a ghost when we have so many more normal, more horrific interpretations of this, where ghosts have unfinished business and they're sinister, or they're out to get you, or they want things to happen, like they're against the living or something like that. And seeing it from the other side and going, oh, it's silly. There's a lot of potential comedy in this. And they do a lot of that really well for a lot of the film. And then they introduce Beetlejuice, and Beetlejuice is a completely separate movie. Beetlejuice, the character, does not really have a place in this film. And I know that is probably sacrilege to some people, because don't get me wrong, Beetlejuice is sort of a fascinating character on his own. And this separate line of what happens in this bureaucracy to ghosts or people or demons or whatever anything is, that do not fit within this bureaucratic nature of the afterlife, this idea of the afterlife, or the exploration of either a Christian or non-Christian interpretation of like purgatory, hell, these different things that it starts to touch on briefly, but doesn't really explore very much at all. So I felt shorted in watching. I felt shorted on the relationship between Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis, who I really like and think are really fascinating characters, and their struggles to sort of deal with being dead and be ghosts is so fascinating on its own. And I felt like I didn't get enough of them. But then I get this Beetlejuice through line, which is the motivations are unclear. His character is unclear. His source, background, and motivations are unclear. He's sort of a nebulous problem to be solved. And I think that is underserving the potential of that character. There is more potential there that is not explored. Ultimately, neither of them get sort of where I want them to be. And the end of the movie comes somewhat abruptly. And it starts to feel a little bit more like an 80s or 90s comedy, like just straight comedy, where there are horrific aspects, but they are not really, those stop being the key. And the important elements are more the like classic 80s or 90s family comedy, like how do we solve this familial dispute kind of thing. And it really undercuts some of the unique aspects of the setting that they've set up. The movie I was actually thinking most about that I don't believe I've brought up yet is Brazil, which is a weird movie that I can't possibly explain to anyone. And if you haven't seen a Terry Gilliam film of any Terry Gilliam film before, I can't possibly explain it either. The closest I can get is to say Terry Gilliam was a member of Monty Python, and there are some influences there that go through to his later career, but that would be doing a great disservice to an understanding of what Terry Gilliam's films are really like. They are fascinating on their own and could be talked about for ages and ages. But for those who have seen both this film and Brazil, which I think I recommend both, I think some of both the aesthetic through lines and the narrative through lines are very interesting in their parallels. The both character-wise, visuals-wise, the sort of the aesthetic influences. There's a lot of German expressionism in a lot of Terry Gilliam's films, but especially in Brazil. And it is a style that is not often seen. So to see those parallels along with some of the storyline parallels really made me wish that even for some of the problems that Brazil has, it is a much more complete story. It is somewhat intentional in its lack of completion, whereas this feels like multiple different ideas that ultimately don't come together cohesively. They all stand alone, or the two things, I should say, stand alone, and they cross over enough that they don't seem juxtaposed in an awkward way, but they don't quite work together. My expectation going into the film is that the film was going to be mostly about Beetlejuice. I mean, his name is in the name. Although, as far as spelling goes and why the movie is spelled Juice, but it's supposed to be a reference to the star Beetlejuice, which is Geuse, I think. And also the subtitles mostly show it as the latter. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I thought the movie was mostly going to be about him and dealing with him as some sort of existential threat to living people, some sort of possession, demonic, semi-demonic comedy, mopey teen tries to contact the dead and hijinks ensue kind of thing. That's what I was expecting. So do we see this whole other more major, I would say, narrative element about the dead couple is not what I expected at all. And so I was expecting a full movie of how do you deal with Beetlejuice? What are his powers? What does he get up to? What is his, like, how does he manifest himself? And what is the ultimate threat from his presence? Especially since, there's the parallel between Beetlejuice being said 3 times versus something like Bloody Mary or any other number of scary story kind of things that are supposed to, like, you say their name 3 times. So I feel like I was sort of cheated out of exploring him very much. He's just sort of a weirdo, mostly. His threat is kind of limited and not particularly real feeling, even when the threat is imminent, that he presents nearer the end of the film. Meanwhile, they've also cut off this exploration of this couple and the dead and the bureaucracy that I think would be really very comedy fodder. So while I do like the film and I like a lot of things about the film and would probably recommend that it be seen by lots of people, it still doesn't come together as a cohesive narrative, and I think that's always going to bite at me, no matter how well I like everything else. I'm really curious for people who have either been longtime fans or who don't have the same like cinematic references that I do, what the reflection upon this is. As someone who's a little moderate on Tim Burton as well, I know that there are some people who are just like, oh, it's another great Tim Burton film or something like that. But I only have my own perspective to work from. There's a lot that's interesting here. I think this could be. I know I've heard over time that people getting excited about the potential for a sequel or something like that. And back in, I think, 2017 or 2018 or something, it had there was an adaptation made for an off-Broadway theater show, musical theater, that I guess from what I understood until a few days ago when I was looking it up, I was under the impression that it didn't do very well, and then it closed because of the pandemic, and it never made to Broadway, and it was basically considered to be dead, even though a lot of people really, really liked it. Even people who had no prior experience with with Beetlejuice. And I heard enough good things about it that it made me kind of sad that I thought I would never see it. Now it turns out that it has fairly recently, I don't know when exactly, it got a Broadway run, and now it's going on tour across substantial parts of the U.S. at least, which is fascinating. I do wonder. I mean, this is a Warner Brothers owned IP. I assume that the IP is licensed to whoever made the musical. I'm always kind of slight tangent for a moment, if you'll forgive me. I am very happy when theater is made more accessible via digital means, whether it's streaming services like obviously Hamilton, most is probably the most widely known thing recently during the pandemic. Was a filming of it, a professional filming of it was put on Disney Plus. And having seen Hamilton both in that setting and in person, and seen a lot of other things, musical and just general theater, I'm always happy when there's a digital version of it, but it is not the same thing as seeing it in person. Being able to, or being, having a stage show be controlled, having your vision of a stage show be controlled by camera choice is generally more of a disservice than it is a service to the theater. But I digress. I would love to potentially see what's been done with this as an adaptation. As I understand, I'm not really big into musical, or I'm not like I'm not an expert on musical theater by any means. I hear from sources that are more knowledgeable than me that it's very good, has some good names attached to it, both in terms of performers, writers, composers, so on and so forth, and that it was sort of a shame that it went out. So I'm curious about it. I'd sort of like to see it in theater, but I'd also be interested in just seeing a recording of it. And if, with this being a fairly popular piece of cinema first, then sort of this is the point I was trying to get to for the last 3 minutes. If that gets more stage shows put on streaming platforms so they can be made more accessible to people who either for money and or location reasons can't see these shows, I think that's a great thing. And I would really encourage that to happen, even if I have my own qualms about the state of the recordings. Yeah, I don't know. This is like it's a really interesting thing that I'm probably going to have to rewatch at some point. Give me your takes. I think this is a pretty widely viewed film, so I'd be very curious what other people's reflections are on it. I keep asking that, and nobody ever replies. Anyway, reply anyway. Ignore what I just said. Be the outlier that actually leaves a comment. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.